It's my job to make sure that you don't fall asleep, but I'm sorry, I can't guarantee that you won't get indigestion now. I'm going to talk pretty quickly because I never know when Kevin's going to just tell me that we're open to questions. So that's basically what I'm going to talk about. Let's get right into it. But I'm going to change the order slightly and give you the final punchline just in case we run out of time. Over the long term, which might be, well, starting within the next probably 3 or so years, I submit that we will see the beginnings of these trends. Relocalization, or an unwinding of globalization. Ruralization, that'll probably start a little bit later on. Recycling type economy, some people call it the salvage economy. The end of consumerism, and a bit later on depopulation as well. Anybody got indigestion yet? Okay, so let's try and substantiate this. The world, not just the United States, is addicted to oil. It provides more than a third of our primary energy supply. Gas and coal and oil together provide over 80% of the world's primary energy. Geothermal, solar and wind, less than 1%. A bit of hydro. Critically, oil provides 95% of transport fuels globally, and even more so in South Africa. It powers industrial agriculture. All the machinery, the pesticides, the fertilizers come from natural gas. Many of the products we use, from your toothpaste to the pills you pop to the clothes you wear, the paints, etc., come from oil. So we really are very, very dependent on the substance. So I'm going to deal with a number of assumptions and then look at some of the facts to contrast with those assumptions. The one is that business as usual will carry on. So this amazing exponential curve that we've seen over the last 50 years or even more, if one goes back to the Industrial Revolution, we assume is going to, well, many people assume is going to continue. Growth of the economy, human population, rates of urbanization, and consumerism. However, as Kenneth Boulding once said, anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. I'm an economist, maybe I'm a madman as well, but I don't believe in continuous economic growth. We've got many warning signs that our trajectory is not sustainable. The financial volatility, which many people don't seem to connect to real resource issues, but I'll argue is connected, is just one sign of this. Climate change is another, which is becoming stronger every day, or every year at least. Growing water scarcity in many parts of the world, soil degradation, that's a much neglected resource, absolutely critical. Collapse of fisheries around the world, deforestation, and fossil fuel depletion, which I'm going to focus on this afternoon. So the second assumption is that there's plenty of oil left to power our global economic system. If you listen to BP, they keep telling us every year that we've got 40 years worth of oil. But that, for one thing, doesn't allow for growth, right? That's as if we're consuming the same rate of oil today. So what about the 17 million new cars that China's putting on its road this year? Where's the oil going to come from? If we had to grow it 2% a year, you get much less than 40 years consumption left. However, with oil, it's not like your car. You're not going to consume a certain amount of oil globally every year and then suddenly you're going to drop down to zero. That's just impossible. If you look at any oil field in the world, production rises up to a maximum, stays on a bit of a plateau for a while, and then when most of the oil, or usually only about 40% of it has been recovered, production drops off and goes down to zero. And if you add up a number of these different production profiles into a region, like a country, like the United States, it traces out this roughly bell-shaped curve. In fact, you can go to the United States data and see that in the red bars are the discoveries, which peaked in the 1930s. And lo and behold, because you can only produce what you've discovered, production of oil in the lower 48 states of the US peaked in 1970 and have been declining ever since, despite rapid rises in the price of oil in the 1970s and recently, and phenomenal technological improvements haven't reversed that declining trend. If you look at North America as a whole, it peaked in the mid-80s. Europe peaked in the year 2000. About 40 out of 54 oil-producing nations already passed their production peaks. So it's really just a matter of time before the globe as a whole peaks in terms of oil production. Never mind, when prices rise, we'll find more oil. That's economics 101, isn't it? Well, the problem is that oil is a finite resource. And at some point, no matter how high the price rises, you're not going to find more of it, because it just isn't there. We've already burned about half of the conventional oil resources, a bit more than half. Discoveries globally of oil peaked in the 1960s and have been on a declining trend ever since then. So if we have a similar time gap as in the United States, which has been one of the best oil provinces in the world, then that takes us to around about now, or a few years ago. The historical oil production in the Second World War, it was about 5 million barrels a day. That's what Japan was consuming about 2 or 3 years ago. We had the golden age of economic growth in the 1950s and 60s, which was enabled by really cheap and abundant supplies of petroleum, which were growing at about 7% a year. Then we had the 1970s oil shocks, and stagflation entered the lexicon, and we had a really huge change. We had the worst economic recessions since the Second World War. And then we had another period of very cheap oil prices until the Great Recession, which at least in part was triggered by the oil shock in 2008. Why did the oil price go up to $147 a barrel? Well, there were a few reasons, but the fundamental one was that supply was stagnant from around 2004, 2005. In the face of rapidly rising demand in countries like China and India and a lot of the oil-producing countries themselves. So we had OPEC increasing consumption 2 million barrels a day. The OECD had to reduce consumption. Right? There was more slack in their system, prices went up, constant supply, so the allocation had to be redirected from the OECD to other countries, to emerging market countries. So where do we go from here? The best evidence available, and there is uncertainty because oil reserve data is state secrets in countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc. They produce numbers, they don't update them from year to year. But there are a lot of independent geologists who've been studying this for many years, and there are other people, engineers who study the number of oil projects under development and how much oil can possibly be brought to market within the next 5 to 10 years. And the consensus that is emerging is that within about 2 to 3 years, oil production will probably start its downward phase. It's inevitable that it will start declining year after year sometime. It's just a question of exactly when. But even more to the point, only about half of the world's daily production of about 86, 87 million barrels is actually traded. The rest gets consumed within producing countries. So world oil exports is what is really important for countries like South Africa that imports most of its oil or its liquid fuels. And in fact, world oil exports peaked in 2005 and have been on the declining trend since then. So from that point of view, we're already beyond peak oil, which again helps to explain the rapid rise in prices over the past few years. Another indicator underlying this is the increase in the marginal cost of oil production. Moving from countries like Saudi Arabia through Russia, China, conventional, then deep offshore wells, Canadian tar sands, the costs of producing are much higher. So again, the price of oil has to rise. This in turn reflects a critically important variable called energy return on energy invested. In order to extract oil out of the ground, you have to explore for it, you have to build oil rigs, you have to transport them, you have to physically drill down sometimes a few kilometers into the earth, you have to pump the oil out, you have to build pipelines, transport, you have to build refineries, etc., etc. So this measures the amount of energy that you get out at the end of that whole process relative to the amount of energy you've invested in order to extract it and deliver it to markets. Now in the 1930s, in America at least, the return on investment was about 100 barrels out for every barrel of oil put in. Fantastic rate of return. By the 1970s it was down to 30 to 1, and globally now it's around about 15 to 1. Remember those figures. Okay, so that's a declining. Why does this happen? Why does it decline over time? Because economics says you go and exploit your cheapest, easiest resources first and leave the more difficult stuff like Gulf of Mexico, like Arctic, for later on. Now, because you have to invest a certain,
Can we return to the previous slide, please?
Certainly.
I just want to make sure I understand the metric. Are you saying that in the 1970s you had to spend 100 barrels of oil?
No, it's the other way around. It's energy out versus energy in.
Okay, so?
So in the 1970s, you're getting 30 barrels of oil out for every barrel of oil you're investing in.
For 1 barrel?
For 1 barrel, yeah. So this is just it's a ratio, it's a 2 1, 100 to 1, 30 to 1, 15 to 1. Now on this graph, on the horizontal axis, you've got that same energy return on investment ratio, starting there at 50 to 1 all the way down to 1 to 1. And the dark part represents the net energy, the surplus energy that you get out. The little grey part at the top is the amount of energy you've invested in. So when you've got a very high energy return on investment, 50 to 1, you're getting about 97% of the energy is useful to society. The other 3% is used for your energy infrastructure. If you go all the way down, you'll see that it falls off a cliff when you get down to about 5, 6 energy return on investment ratio. You look at biofuels like corn ethanol, and it's right down the right-hand side. It's really uneconomic. It makes very little sense. The tar sands in Canada are just about the tipping point in that cliff. Okay, assumption number 4. Okay, well, if oil really is running out, then certainly we must have alternatives, right? We can just switch across to them. That's economics 201. The only problem is we've got other finite resources that we're depending on. And all finite resources will over time go through that very roughly bell-shaped production curve pattern. Recent studies have suggested that global coal production is likely to peak this decade. In energy terms, the energy content might peak this year, according to one study published in May last year. That's because the same thing with the oil, you're going to mine the easiest to extract coal, the surface deposits, early on. And then gradually you're going to go and you're going to mine the lower quality reserves, which is what Eskom's been complaining about here for the last year or so. What about natural gas? Well, it's going to go through the same cycle. Its peak is going to be somewhat later than oil and maybe even after coal. But really it's needed for the electricity generation, the production of fertilizers, etc. So it can't really be a substitute for dwindling oil and coal. The other point is that these three fossil fuel prices are pretty closely linked. In 2008, they all experienced a spike. Although oil does sell at a premium because it's even more useful than the others, it's more easy to transport, it's got a very high energy density. What about biofuels? Well, really, if you want starving populations, failed states, then certainly biofuels are the way to go. But most countries, it's really not economic. One exception is Brazil, where they get about an 8 to 1 return on investment for their energy return investment for their ethanol made from sugar. But they've got the right climate, they've got plenty of space, they've got plenty of water. Nuclear electricity, as we've seen recently, has got immense risks attached. Never mind the issue that there's still no solution for the disposal of waste. And recent studies have suggested that mined uranium is likely to peak by 2015, which in itself will cap the amount of nuclear electricity. This, the picture there is from an earlier study which suggests there might be around 2025, even up to a bit later, 2040s. But a study coming out this year says probably 2015 is more likely. The problem with a lot of the alternatives, the other problem is that the energy return on investment is a lot lower than what we've experienced for oil historically. So exceptions are hydro. Coal is still up there in some parts of the world, 80-1, still really high. But if you look at others, even the renewables, less than 20, a lot of them less than 10. Corn ethanol is absolute no-no. Shale oil, oil sands near the bottom here, very, very low. So that means you're not delivering much of a real usable surplus energy to society. Okay, well, if supplies of oil and its substitutes are really not that rosy after all, then surely we'll just use less fuel as prices rise, and there will be no problems. Well, the problem is that historically, at least, oil consumption and economic growth have been really tightly coupled. The other problem is that in countries like America, oil shocks typically cause recessions. Pretty severe ones. In America, something like 9 out of the 10 recessions subsequent to the Second World War have been preceded by a spike in oil prices. The replacement of our current internal combustion engine vehicles will take decades. We can't afford to just scrap them all, within a few years and replace them with electric cars. There are something like 800 million internal combustion engines driving around the world's roads at the moment. Many consumers in the short term face limited alternatives. Demand is still growing very rapidly, like I mentioned, China. Their oil demand is growing at 10% a year. They now consume more than 9 million barrels a day. So every year, just China alone is going to be consuming an extra 1 million barrels of oil a day per year. That's about what Libya was exporting. So what this means is that in the short term at least, if you get a contraction in supply, you're going to have a very dramatic spike in prices in order to suppress demand. Okay, then surely technology is going to bail us out, right? We're going to invent something else. We're going to have quick innovations and new technologies, and if nothing else, then the hydrogen economy is going to bail us out. Well, in practice, it takes many years to commercialize and scale up a new technology. Cell phones, ubiquitous now, it took about 20 years. Personal computers, the same thing. Most technologies, it's about 20 years from initial market penetration to saturation. So the other problem is that all of the substitutes currently rely on oil. Take a wind turbine. Well, first you've got to make the steel. Okay, that requires coal. Then you've got to transport the components to where they're going to be erected, lift them up with cranes, etc. You also use rare earth metals, another finite resource, of which China produces 95% and is slapping on export bans. So you run into other resource problems. Then hydrogen. This is a fantastic myth that we can have a hydrogen economy to replace the oil economy. Hydrogen is a net energy loser. You can only get hydrogen from fossil fuels or from electrolyzing water. If you take electricity and you split the hydrogen from the oxygen in water, it takes more energy in the electricity than you get out from the hydrogen. It just doesn't make sense. So it's going to take time. Even a crash program of mitigation would take a number of years to start making any impact on declining oil supplies. The contest between reality and assumptions, reality always wins. Okay, so now some implications. Well, we can look at scenarios for future trends in energy, resource use, pollution, population. This is one from David Holmgren, who was one of the originators of the concept of permaculture. And what most people assume is that we're going to get the techno-explosion route, but as I think I've demonstrated, that looks very unlikely at the moment. The one thing that might do this is fusion technology, nuclear fusion. emulating the sun in terms of creating energy. The problem is they've been working on that for at least 5 decades and haven't cracked it yet. Techno-stability, that's what most of your greens think is desirable or even possible. We're just going to roll over into renewable energy. But as I said, the resource constraints underlying a lot of the renewable energy technologies, even if there's plenty of sunlight and wind, the actual infrastructure needed to harness those require materials themselves. So a more realistic scenario is a managed decline, or that's the more optimistic one. And the less optimistic one is a rapid decline in energy and a collapse in the global economy. And that would be bound up very much with financial issues, which I'll talk about for a minute or two. The impacts are going to depend on a range of factors. Nobody's certain at what rate oil will decline every year once it enters its decline phase. If we're lucky, it'll only be about 2% a year, but more likely it's going to be more, maybe 5%, maybe even more. Resource nationalism has emerged over the last few years as a big issue in relation to many resources, not least of which oil, where countries decide they'd rather hold on to their oil, either for their own populations for later on, or because they anticipate that the prices will rise, and so rather sell it at a higher price in a few years' time. Geopolitics, like events in the Middle East, Libya, etc., civil conflict in Nigeria, also have an impact on oil flows. Speculation on hoarding activities amplify the problems in oil markets. They send prices, oil prices into bubble territory, which then pop, and so you get excessive volatility, which in turn makes it more difficult for energy companies to invest because of all the uncertainty. On the mitigation side, if there were crash programs of investment in energy efficiency, conservation, and alternative energy sources, then the impacts of people will be a lot less severe. Under business as usual conditions, without decoupling energy use or oil use from economic growth or the economic activity, a decline in oil availability is going to translate into a contracting economy year after year. This creates problems in a world where we have a financial system that is predicated on continuous economic growth. US debt, and this figure is even a couple of years old, it's gone even further than that. There are various estimates depending on what you include for US debt. Some say now it's about $50 trillion, which is about 4 times its GDP, 3.5 times GDP. Some say if you included unfunded liabilities for future pensions and Medicare, etc., it's more like $200 trillion. Our monetary system, fractional reserve banking, where money is loaned into existence by commercial banks mostly, not central banks or governments. Most of it's commercial banks, giving out mortgages, loans to businesses. It's got interest attached to it. The only way that you can finance that interest over time is if your economy continually expands. If you get zero growth, let alone contracting economy for any length of time, you get massive waves of debt defaults and bankruptcies. We've seen that there are physical limits to growth, at least growth in the way that we've known it, which has always been resource intensive throughout the period of the Industrial Revolution. So without a decoupling of resource use from economic or GDP growth, the end of growth means a collapse of the desk-based money system. These are just some of an interconnected set of issues, global issues: the financial instability, the fossil fuel depletion, climate change, food security and water, geopolitical tensions. I'm not going to run through all of the connections, but obviously it's a very complex situation. What's the medium-term outlook over the next, say, 3 to 5 years? Well, we're going to run into the next round of oil supply-demand crunch, which means more spikes, followed by an oil price drop as demand destruction takes effect. We're going to see physical oil shortages. Many countries are experiencing these already. We haven't experienced this in South Africa as yet, but a lot of countries, the poorer countries, this is day-to-day reality. They just can't afford enough. Rising inflation, and with that interest rates, the European Central Bank has just hiked interest rates by 0.25%, and their inflation rate's only 2.7%. In my view, that's a very questionable decision. Just on that point, there are two ways to get out of a debt crisis. You can either have a deflation with associated bankruptcies and mass unemployment, or you can have an inflation, possibly even hyperinflation. Because if you expand your money supply rapidly and you have inflated prices, then the real value of your debts diminish over time. Recession and further rises in unemployment and a financial crash. So this is under business as usual policies and business decisions. And resource wars. More resource wars. Okay, there will be winners and losers. It's not all bad news for everybody. But as we've seen, things like fossil fuels, nuclear power are going to be on their way down. Of course, the oil companies are going to be making massive windfall profits in the meantime, unless action is taken to tax those, redistribute them. Airlines will be the first casualty, as they were in 2008, when about 30 airlines dropped out of the skies, figuratively. Internal combustion engine automobiles, tourism, throwaway products, industrial agriculture, suburban real estate will be some of the biggest losers. The sunrise industries, renewables, energy efficiency, telecoms, teleconferencing. In a few years' time, I'll be doing this from Skype, from my little place in the country, rather than flying all the way up here. Organic food and agriculture, railways, bicycles, electric bicycles, and so on.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Why nuclear? Why is it on the way out?
Why is what?
Nuclear power on the way out?
Because of depleting uranium, and because of public sentiment against nuclear as a result of Fukushima, etc. We're seeing, okay, already Germany and Switzerland are going to close down the nuclear industries. But the main limiting factor will be uranium. This is assuming that fusion doesn't, the fusion issue doesn't get cracked.
But what about the enriched uranium, or uranium as a byproduct of gold production?
Well, that's why.
Quantities of uranium.
Yeah, that's why South Africa's uranium production has been in decline for the last 7-8 years, because gold production's been in decline. So our uranium production has been always a byproduct of gold, although there are other deposits of uranium which are being now looked at. But gold production in South Africa peaked in 1970. It's another classic example of the whole resource production profile, the Hubbard peak as it's called. But that's based on a global study which has looked at uranium production all over the world. The major high density deposits have been mined, with some exceptions in Canada, and the rest are very, very low grade ores. It takes a number of years to develop new mines, and they're not going to be able to bring those fast enough. Already at the moment, about a third of the uranium that's used for nuclear power plants every year is coming from decommissioned nuclear warheads, mainly from Russia, some from America. Within about 5 to 10 years, those supplies are going to dry up. So you won't even have enough uranium to fuel existing nuclear power plants, let alone any new ones. So they're really, to simplify things, two paths ahead. The one is a future of oil price shocks, no agreement on climate change, financial meltdown, trade wars, economic collapse, an arms race, which is happening now, and overall race to the bottom. And unfortunately, if you look at the science, that's pretty much the path that we're on at the moment. The alternative one will require unprecedented levels of international cooperation. For example, in an oil depletion protocol, where all the consuming nations agree to reduce their oil consumption annually by the rate at which supplies are depleting, say 3% a year. What that'll do is stabilize prices, guarantee a certain income to the oil producers, but also give a target for all companies and consumers to know that they've got to reduce their oil consumption by 3% a year. It'll create the certainty that's needed for the transition. A climate treaty is really looking less and less likely, especially when fossil fuel prices are going to be going much higher than they are today. Extensive monetary reform, essentially moving away from fractional reserve banking to some form of commodity-backed or energy-backed money system. Globally, one that doesn't transfer wealth towards one current country, which is currently the United States as a reserve currency. It would require technology and aid transfers from richer countries to poorer countries, but much bigger scale than we see today. A localization of economies, because transport costs will be getting much more expensive. So everything becoming more local, both at a national level, say beneficiating your resources more, producing food more locally on a city scale. Reduced military expenditures. There's a vast amount of resources that are currently going into expenditures in military. The United States is spending about $670 billion a year now on the military, on its military. It's about as much as the rest of the world put together. That money could be better spent, obviously. Really, it's just going to take a sustainability mobilization. A mobilization as if we were fighting a war, but one where we're going to wean ourselves off our decadent fossil fuel-based lifestyles. So that's why I came to this long-term prognosis for relocalization. In other words, an unwinding of globalization applied to the trade in physical goods. Over time, at some point, we're going to have a whole lot more people producing food, because at the moment fossil fuels basically allow in industrialized countries about 2 or 3% of the population to produce the food for everybody else. Before even in about 1900 in America, about 70% of the population lived in rural areas and worked on farms. We're going to have to recycle materials, emulating ecological processes. None of this take a resource, put it into your economy and produce goods and waste. We're going to have to close those loops. Consumerism, throwing away your cell phone every couple of years and your TV screen, etc., is not going to be viable. The population issue is a very uncomfortable one for many to confront. Let me just say this to you, that the world population in 1830, so before the fossil fuel era, was 1 billion. In 1930, it reached 2 billion. In 1960, it reached 3 billion. We're now at almost 7 billion. It is largely because we tapped a once-off deposit of fossil fuels that we've used about half of them within 100 years. So in the long term, the next century or two, the human population is going to have to shrink quite significantly. Hopefully in a managed process rather than one managed by nature. So peak oil is basically now. We're we're on the plateau at the top. We've got very little time left to mobilize to effect a transition. Business as usual applied in many different fields will simply fail. We're going into a whole different era. And what we need now is a mobilization for sustainability across all aspects of our society. Thank you very much.